this podcast, we will be looking at storytellers, stories, and the reasons that oral storytelling is important in our world today. You would think with all the technology we have available that stories do not have a place anymore, but they are needed more than ever. For in storytelling is where we find truth, we find reality, and we find the heart of what it is to be human. Welcome to the heart of storytelling. My name is Alyssa, and let's go on an adventure.
A couple of weeks ago, we had at Emerson a storyteller come to tell us a story and did an hour-long show very much about climate change. Kerima generously agreed to do an interview with me afterwards. Karina's interview is a really great example of applied storytelling, of where you can use storytelling not in performance spaces but in advocacy and activism, and I thought it was a really great opportunity to talk to someone who worked in that space. Although that's not the space that I'm intending to work in, it might be one of you listeners that you might be wanting to work in that space. So I hope you enjoy this interview with Kerima. Welcome to this week's episode. This week I'm speaking with Kerima Mohideen, who is in London. Hi, Kerima.
Hi.
So tell me, what's your journey to storytelling? How did you get there?
Oh, well, I'm a teacher like you. I've always worked in English language and literacy and EAL. So oracy and spoken English and spoken language is particularly important. But it goes back a bit before that. I'm half Sri Lankan. My father, who's Sri Lankan, was a great storyteller. Just in the home. And he always told me how he learned a lot of his stories from, as a child, listening to the women working in the kitchen, because he grew up in a much more communal setting, which was still there when I was a child, and I also experienced to some extent. They lived behind a mosque in a compound with lots of families, and often there were lots of people in the kitchen preparing meals because people always dropped around at mealtime. And that's where he said he listened to a lot of stories. So it was always something that I thought, he used to have my son totally entranced by his stories, some of which were true and some of which were folk tales and things, but often true stories as well. And I never thought I could tell stories in that way. But then it has always been part of my teaching, and I use a lot of drama in my education work. And a few years ago, so shortly before I retired, the English department in this big secondary school that I worked in came along to our English as an additional language department, where my colleagues, there were 2 Kurdish teachers and myself, and they said, you guys must know lots of stories and be used to storytelling. Will you come and tell our year 7s some stories, because we're doing folk tales as part of the English curriculum. So we were somewhat taken aback by this stereotyping. And after we'd got over our shock, we all kind of thought, well, why not then? We'll do it. And so, of course, it wasn't, like a natural thing for me. But I thought long and hard about it. And then I thought, and I don't even know what story would represent me culturally as a mixed race person who's grown up all over the place and, not necessarily deeply part of a community with a particular culture, although that is in my heritage. And eventually I came up with, I thought, I'll tell one of the Sinbad the Sailor stories. There's one in which he visits the island of Serendib, which is in fact Sri Lanka. And it was then that I thought, yeah, this is actually quite fun. And I looked for storytelling courses, and I found Emerson College, and I started by doing a few courses there, and that's what took me on my storytelling journey.
Oh, wow. And so how long ago was that?
That was probably about 10 years ago.
Okay. And so where have you gone since then? What's been the progression since you've done the courses?
I don't do a lot of storytelling, so I wouldn't call myself a professional storyteller. In fact, I tend to see it more as a sort of verb. Storytelling is something I do rather than something I am. And and it's part of a lot of other things that I do. So as I mentioned, it's always been, I think it's a very, very important part of education, and it should be there in, we should be doing it with young people, with children, because encouraging that confidence in your voice is very important. And to be able to do it without relying on a written text. And I think that's an important thing. And that's always been part of my sort of educational work. But also, I'm an environmental and human rights, social justice activist. And I came specifically on the 3-month storytelling course to create a story that I could use as part of campaigning. And I work particularly with a small NGO as the education and outreach worker, which works with communities that are affected by or threatened by large-scale mining projects, which are, by London-listed mining companies. So some of the big giants of the world, the mining world. And I wanted to create a story that specifically spoke to that I could use as part of that education work. So yes, it's very much, I suppose I could describe myself as, what I do is sort of activist storytelling.
Beautiful.
But sometimes I just tell stories as well.
Well, that's fun too.
Yeah.
So what sort of effect, I mean, if you're working in activism, what effects are you creating? What's the outcomes that come from when you do that work?
That's interesting. I guess when you tell a story that has that sort of political and awareness raising aspect to it, you reach more audiences than you would if people were just coming to a meeting to hear about the issues. And I think that it also is a nice way of slipping it into people's minds. But also, I think the really important thing about it is that you can have a discussion about it afterwards, and maybe the story brings people together in a, it's something everyone has enjoyed together, and so perhaps it creates an atmosphere where you can have a discussion without it being too polarized as well.
So you mean like they're discussing the story and the issues in the story, but
Yes,
it keeps it in a safe container? Is that?
yes.
Yeah.
Well, ideally that's the idea. It doesn't always work, but yes.
Yeah. No, I mean, because we're dealing with some quite big issues, so
Yes.
yeah, you want to be able to have that dialogue without making it personal, I guess, really, don't you?
Yes.
And letting people have their voice. Yeah. So would you tell mostly folk tales or fairy tales, or do you have a specific type of story you tell?
Various. I really like folk tales. I like them because they're often about ordinary people, humble people. I struggle with myths a bit. I've always liked myths. I've read them myself a lot ever since a child. But when it comes to telling them, I think I think context is very important. What is the context of these stories? Who created them? What was the society like that they come from? What do they tell us about that society? And what do we have to learn? So I've got a kind of a historical materialist approach to this as well. And it worries me that we often read into myths all sorts of things for us and our psyche that aren't necessarily what was the intention behind them. I mean, they might have been, but they might not have been. And that I do have a problem with the sort of hero's journey approach to things. So that's why I like kind of folk tales, because they're often the stories that maybe ordinary people told, and and they're often the heroes in them might be, or are quite humble people. And and it's about them overcoming difficulties. Sometimes there's a lot of humor, animals, and I think they're also quite suitable for young people as well.
I mean, there is quite a difference between a myth and a folk tale in terms of the characters.
Yes.
I mean, the characters are gods in the myths.
Yes.
And it's a whole other world that you're dealing with. But I'd like to go
Yes.
back to this idea that looking at the context of a story,
So what sort of process do you go through when you're preparing or telling a story? What's the way you work?
I do a lot of research.
Yeah.
I try to find um, as many versions of the story as possible, but I also try to find out about the story and also to understand the place that it comes from, or it may come from more than one place. It's interesting to find a story and then find that it's also told in other parts of the world, and to try and understand as far as possible what it might mean to the people whose artifact it is, who the and also to think about what life is like for those people now. So when I did my story that I created on the 3-month course, I actually did take a myth or a legend. It's the Ramayana, but because I have quite a lot of experience and knowledge about campaigning about environmental and human rights issues in India, I understood that this myth meant many different things to different people, and that it wasn't necessarily there isn't even necessarily one version of it told, even though there are some literary versions of it, and so I wanted to tell it in a different way, and I did a lot of research into that, and what I came up with actually was my own version of it. It wasn't any particular Indigenous groups version, but it drew on the understanding and the critiques that come from the contemporary people whose story, who know that story and who's part of it, their culture. So feminist versions, Indigenous versions, various different. So the heroes aren't necessarily, or the gods in them aren't necessarily heroes or gods to all people. They might be villains to some people. And also I think it's really important, if there is a literary work like that, to go back to the original literary work. And even though it's very long, you find things in it that aren't necessarily there in all the sort of short versions that you get that are retold for children or summarized on the internet or whatever, which I think a lot of work is needed. I think that's the research. It's like the iceberg, isn't it? What you actually tell is just the thing that sticks out at the top of the ocean, but underneath is all that other work that you have done.
Absolutely.
That informs the story.
Yeah,
so
I couldn't
that's
agree
the
more.
process.
The research is actually my favorite part of everything.
Yes.
It's fine.
Same here.
It's the thing that really lights me up, and I'm happy to do that as a job for other people if they hate it.
Yes.
Because I really love it.
Yes, but I think it's really important that people do it, because I think it's what makes their story rich. And when I came and performed on your course a couple of weeks ago, a woman who asked the question about she was worried about whether it would be okay for her to tell some of the stories that I tell about South Asia, because I'm obviously part South Asian and she's not. But I think that if you do that research, you can make those stories. You can then tell those stories. You don't have to, But and that research does mean also understanding the situations of those people who live in those places. Now as well, and respecting that. Yes.
So understanding the context and
The context,
that really depth of understanding of it.
Yes.
And doing it an honor. I agree with that. I'm not going to argue with you. That's particularly, So where do you do the work? Is it in community groups or corporate or schools, or where do you work mostly?
I'm not a great one for self-promoting, partly because I'm quite busy with my other work, and so I haven't sort of gone out of my way to try and find storytelling work, but I do get asked to do it sometimes. So mostly I've told I've performed at a couple of festivals, like the Oxford Storytelling Festival, and I've also went to the Bradford Literary Festival last year. I've in London, I have worked in contexts like the city farms. So several summers running, I've told stories at Spitalfields City Farm, mostly to children and outdoors. And there's not far from where I live, there's a place called the South London Botanical Institute, which is a rather interesting and quite unique place. And I've told stories there, and we've done some tree walks, and I've told stories for those. And I really like that kind of thing. I like the outdoors, and I mean, I don't do my big performances like the one I did at Emerson and the one I prepared before for that sort of thing. But I've done those lots of other stories for these sort of events. But I've also the previous performance that I did, the one that involves the Ramayana and the forests and the human rights defenders and everything, that one I've also told at meetings. I've told it at a meeting at Amnesty International, which was about the topics, and at SOAS, which is the School of Oriental and African Studies, in their Brunei gallery, where they had an exhibition about those particular issues, the struggles for the forest in India. And so there's a variety of different contexts.
So do people seek you out, or did you reach out to some of those organizations yourself?
Some of the things where I've, like the Bradford Literary Festival and the Spitalfields City Farm, they found me because I have a small blog, and but others, it's because I already know some of those people because of the other work that we do together. And so when I said I'm doing this story, they said, "Oh, we could use that." Yeah. So
yeah, that's good. It's nice to hear that there's a combination of self-driven activity and then people finding you by word of mouth and things, which is really good. So do you think this will be something you continue doing into the future? What's the future looking like for you?
I hope so. I'd like to think about another sort of storytelling performance, or an hour-long thing. I'd also like to do a little bit more work, if I can make some time. I'd like to do a little bit more work again with young people in schools, perhaps getting them to tell stories as well. I'm not sure yet at the moment, because there's quite a lot of other things happening as well. I'm involved in this group called the Fossil Free Science Museum Coalition, where we have been campaigning to get various large corporate sponsors out of the Science Museum. And there's been a lot of work going on around that, and that keeps me quite busy as well. And I have some education projects that I've designed around some of that, which I've also used with groups, which are not storytelling, although they connect, but they're not.
Yeah, I wonder, I've been thinking a bit about, a lot of people don't say fairy tales and things are not relevant anymore, and they've been taken off library shelves, and I think perhaps the reason that we're in this giant pickle is because we have taken the stories away. I've just been sitting with that a little bit about perhaps we need to bring these stories back so we don't hit ourselves on a path of self-destruction. So this podcast,
I couldn't agree more.
it's just me pondering. I'm wondering, so the podcast is called The Heart of Storytelling, and keeping in mind that the work that you're doing, what do you think is at the heart of the oral tradition? Why is it we need it?
I think it's, well, what you just said about the power of the imagination is very, very important. And I worry that if we can't imagine a better future for ourselves, then we are really going to struggle to change things for the better. So I think that stories, and like you say, fairy stories and folk tales and all of those things, they are an important part of our cultural heritage and help us do that. And it makes me sad. I grew up with lots and lots of stories and fairy tales and books of fairy tales and things, and I loved them as a child. And I also think there's a fantastic wealth of imaginative literature for young people that's contemporary as well. And so I'm glad to see that it's still there, but perhaps we should also not ditch the old one. So that's one thing. But I also, the thing about oral storytelling in particular is something about it's a communal thing. It's something people do together. They get together and tell stories. I really like for me, what I prefer to the whole idea of performance storytelling is more the things like the storytelling clubs and people getting together to tell stories. I think that's an important, and what people do in that is they make connections. It helps some people overcome loneliness. It's about being able to listen to each other and to speak and to develop confidence in your speaking and to support people in developing their confidence. All of that is absolutely necessary. And for me, I think that is actually one of the most important parts of the heart of storytelling.
Connection. And when you work with children, do you find and young people, do you find that they're easy to engage, or anybody really? Because we are a very tech-heavy world. Are people open to the oral tradition?
Yes, actually. One of the things that sometimes worries me is that when you get asked along to some small venue like a city farm or something, people imagine that storytelling is for the youngest children. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think there's a very specific skill involved in working with under fives, for example. And also, I've done some training of people around reading to children, and again, I've always thought you can't expect little children to sit in a group and listen while you read them a story or tell them a story. That's more about having them on your lap and read, that individual intimacy, and telling, like between parent and child. So I'm always a little reluctant to work with very, very young children in that way, although I think there are people who can do that. But with older children, it's generally not been a problem, much to my surprise. And even I for a while, I was teaching a group of, well, I was supposed to be just supporting some individual teenagers in a school, but the teacher in charge of them asked me if I could do some storytelling workshops with them as well, and I did that, and it was great. They were refugee students and they were learning English. But when I told them a story, they were quite a restless group, and when I told them stories at the end of the session, they always calmed down, and it was like you could feel this kind of hush in the room. And I've noticed that also when I've read to groups of, inner city London school children, when I've read stories to them as well, that there's this calming down. And I actually had to stop once and say, why have you all gone so quiet? And they said, we're listening to the story, don't stop. So there is obviously something about it that's calming and that people recognize. And one of the times when I was working at Spitalfields Farm, there was a mother with 2 children, and she was really engaged, because this is the other thing you find often, that these really young children that they bring along go off and play. And the parents are sitting there absolutely enthralled by your stories. and this mother said to me afterwards, oh, she said, it's really been soothing to listen. She said it's like a kind of therapy.
Yeah. I think it's what you just described reminds me of it's almost putting a spell, we crave that.
Yes.
Listening, the story,
Yes.
the sitting in the lap, and I think there's something deep in that that you've identified there, which is really great. Joelle, do you have any advice for people who are looking at starting to tell stories and move into this space? What sort of things helped you on your journey?
I think just find a storytelling group. That really helps, where there is, people who are sympathetic and supportive, and also people who tell stories and who go along to storytelling groups are often really supportive of new storytellers. So I think that's a really good place to start. And also to not try to be too ambitious, find really simple stories to tell to start with, and gradually begin to make them your own. And to just jump in and do it, I think. And then I would really recommend some of the courses at Emerson College as well, for anyone who's able to afford them. And, definitely.
Yeah, I do agree. I mean, it's not all locations have storytelling groups, but maybe very lucky in England to have those spaces where you can go and practice in clubs and things, which is great. So we're down to, yeah.
I'll tell you what, I'll tell you that story about the king and the gardener that I did it the other day.
Love to hear it. Thanks.
Okay, so this is actually an unusual little story that I found in a very big collection of stories that come from Sri Lanka. It's actually the biggest collection of stories. It's called something like Village Folk Tales of Ceylon, and they were collected by someone who worked as a water engineer there. And I think that one of the concerns was the way in which land was being taken for plantations, for tea plantations, initially coffee plantations, tea plantations, rubber plantations, and so on, and the change that was bringing to the village culture. And so he collected the stories. One of the problems with that book, I think, is that there isn't any credit to the people who actually probably did the collecting for him, so and that kind of thing. But nevertheless, it's a really interesting collection. And I found this story in there. What really interested me about it was it had the notes in it at the bottom of the story suggested that there were as an alternative ending to it. So I'll tell you the story, and then I'll tell you about that afterwards. In a certain city, there lived a king who had a beautiful palace surrounded by lovely gardens. Not very far away, he had another piece of land which was completely neglected. One day, he decided that it was time he did something about this piece of land. And so he asked his gardeners, but they were far too busy with the palace gardens and said they couldn't do anything. He sent messengers out, asking if there was someone who could come and take on this piece of land for him. Months went by and he didn't hear anything. And then one day, a very ragged, thin man came to the palace gate and said, "I've come about the gardening job." The king looked him up and down and said, "What qualifies you to be a gardener?" And the man said, "I used to be a farmer." The king didn't think to ask him what happened to his farm and said, "Okay, you'll do." And he took him along to show him the piece of land. The gardener built himself a little shelter in one corner of this land, and then he set to work. He cleared the weeds and the vines and the creepers that were growing through the trees, and he dug over the much neglected beds, and he planted them with vegetables and flowers. He pruned the trees, the mango trees, and soon he transformed the place into a flourishing garden. A year went by, and then another one, and the king once again had paid no attention to this piece of land. So the gardener decided that it was time to show the king what he had done. He collected as much of the produce and the fruit and the vegetables and the flowers that he could, and in a large basket, and sent it to the palace. The king, of course, was delighted with his gift, and he turned to the chief minister and he said, "This man's done a wonderful job. We must go and have a look." They strolled round the gardener, with the gardener proudly showing him all his handiwork. And when they got to the little orchard at one end of the piece of land where the mango trees were, the king said, "Look at those mangoes. They are almost ready for picking. We must make sure they're well protected. We don't want any thieves getting in here and stealing the mangoes." He turned to the chief minister. "You must arm this man. Fetch bow and arrows from the palace." And he turned to the gardener and he said, "You make sure that these mangoes are well guarded, and when they're ripe, send them to me." Well, the gardener, although reluctant, received the bow and arrow and waited for the mangoes to ripen. Meanwhile, the king, back in his palace, said to the chief minister, "Do you remember when we were boys that we used to go into the gardens and steal the mangoes when they were ripe? Those mangoes on my land, they must be ready by now. Wouldn't it be fun if we went and we crept in there and stole them?" The chief minister looked at him and said, "Your Majesty, we were boys then, just children. The gardeners all knew us and the palace guards. We are adults now. You have armed this man. You have told him that if anyone trespasses in the garden and starts to steal the mangoes, he's to shoot them. You could put us in extreme danger. The king said, oh, nonsense, don't worry about it. He probably can't even shoot that well anyway. Let's go and do it. The chief minister sighed. Very well, your majesty. Well, the gardener was woken that night. He could hear noises in the garden coming over from the direction of the mango orchard. There was rustling and voices, and he, as his eyes got used to the dark, he saw, sure enough, he could see two figures, one up in the tree, picking the mangoes and handing them down to another person standing under the tree with a large basket. He got out the bow and arrow, he took aim, and he fired. The arrow hit its mark, and there was a loud thud as the king fell out of the tree and hit the ground. The chief minister turned towards the man's shelter and said, you fool, you have just shot the king. And the gardener rushed over. Ayo, he said, oh no, he said, now I am ruined. The chief minister stood pondering for a moment, looking at the dead king on the ground, and then looking at the gardener. And then he said, you look quite like him, actually. I think there may be a solution to this problem. Quick, swap clothes with him and then bury the body. You can be king in his place. Well, that was what they did. And sure enough, at the palace, no one noticed the switch. The gardener sat on his throne in the king's clothes, and indeed, he probably did look a bit like the king, and no one commented on what had happened. Now, once a week, all of the palace met in the great throne room to pay their respects to the king. All must gather in front of him and bow deeply down to the ground. The king, who was once the gardener, noticed that everyone was bowed low except for the chief minister, who stood staring straight over the crowd at him. He summoned him to his presence and said, listen, I noticed that you did not bow to me, but I am now the king, and you are in the king's house, so you must do what is done in the king's house. And in the collection of stories, this is where the story ends. But then there is a footnote at the bottom saying that the person who collected the story met a Buddhist priest a bit later on after finding this story and shared it with him. And the Buddhist priest said, did you know that there was another ending to this story? And he told this ending. So the king had been on his throne for some weeks, and he had given the warning to the chief minister, who now bowed, as was expected of him. And then one day, a group of farmers came to the palace to ask for justice from the king. For one of the ministers in the palace had stolen their land from them. They were very reluctant to say who it was when the king, who was once the gardener, demanded to know who it was. But they struggled to stop their eyes from shifting in the direction of the chief minister. The king understood at once that it was the chief minister who had stolen their land, and he immediately had him removed from the palace and his land, and confiscated his land and gave it to these farmers. And that is the alternative ending to the story that I thought was very interesting.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
It was wonderful. So
Thank you.
Is that a story you've used often in groups?
Not that often, no. I tend to use I told a story about the Maldives Islands, and that's one I've often used just as a standalone story, because then I can talk about the cabinet minister who had the underwater meeting to raise awareness about the impacts of climate change on small island countries. So that can be used and that could be used by anyone. They don't have to come from South Asia. It can be a standalone lesson or something to stimulate discussion. But this
it really captures the corruption within in governments, really, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So, but this one, I discovered it, and then I put it into that collection that I tell about the the king who makes the journey across the 7 oceans and 13 rivers. But I haven't used it as a standalone story, and I'm still thinking about how I might use it, because I find it really interesting that so long ago people were talking about theft of land and linking it to a folk tale as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming to the end now. So if people want to find out about the work that you're doing and your anything, where can people find you?
Yes. I've got a little blog called Just Storytelling, which people can contact me through, and I also have my email on there as well, and they can find out a little bit about the work I do on it.
Yeah, that'd be amazing.
I'll send you that.
Yeah, send me the links and I'll put it in the chat
links,
so people can find you. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciated it, and appreciated seeing you tell stories a few weeks ago.
Pleasure talking to you. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's our episode for today. I hope you've enjoyed learning about storytelling and folktale, fairytale, myth, legend, or personal tales, wonder tales, all sorts of stories, and the art of storytelling, and why we really need to continue using it today. You can find more information about me at alyssacurtain.com or at Alyssa Curtain Stories on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. I hope that you can find your heart in storytelling.